everyone. Welcome to the Cārvāka podcast. This is your host, kushalmehra. All right. So, today's podcast is part of the series. If you guys remember, I've been trying to do these on and off discussions where I try to have discussions on Hindus, not just in India, but Hindus and the communities outside India in different parts of the world. If you remember, we had a discussion on Hindus in the United Kingdom. I've had discussions on Hindus in North America, primarily America, and maybe now I'll do another discussion on Hindus in Canada. And if so, today's discussion is about Caribbean Hindus, and I'll give you a brief story. People who know me or are consistent know I always say this, that the Caribbean Hindus are the best Hindus, and there's a story to that. I remember when I was studying in New York University, Canada. I was taken to a Caribbean Hindu religious function. It was only Caribbean Hindus by an Indian friend of mine. He said, "You need to check this out." And we went there, and I was like, what's going to happen? I mean, they're just Hindus, right? They might do the puja and and everything like we do it. But yeah, they did do the puja. But then they had their own unique festivities, and it just blew me away. And since that day, I've been a great admirer. And I was always, looking at someone from the Caribbean islands to talk to me. So today we have with us Dr. Baytoram Ramharack. Dr. Baytoram Ramharack was born in Burbis, Guyana. He completed his MA and PhD from NYU and is currently an adjunct associate professor of political science at Nassau Community College in New York. He has written numerous articles and books that discuss Indo-Caribbean history, politics, and society, which can be bought on Amazon. You'll see the link in the description. And he's currently working on a couple of biographical accounts of prominent Indo-Caribbeans. He actively campaigned for the restoration of democracy in Guyana in 1992. He currently lives in New York with his family. And a very important factor, if you're an Indian, he used to be a great cricketer. Dr. Ramharak, welcome to the podcast.
Well, Kushal Namaskar. Good morning. I don't know if all of your guests are actually here with us in the morning, but wherever they are, good evening, good day. It is a pleasure for me, a very sincere pleasure for me to be here on your show today. And hopefully, in my head, I'm hoping to share some information about who we are from the Caribbean. Um, Even though I'm not currently in the Caribbean, I'm living in New York. But my heart is in the Caribbean, more specifically to Guyana. I would be considered a third generation Girmitia, so to speak, from the Caribbean. And for us in the Caribbean, you're looking at primarily three countries where Hindus have a significant population, and those would be Guyana, Trinidad. There's an island connected to Trinidad, Trinidad and Tobago, and of course Suriname. So again, I want to express deep appreciation for you to have me on this show today, and hopefully we can have an interesting discussion about the Hindu family outside of India.
So let's start with the one thing, the beyond our cultural, social, religious identity that ties us to cricket. So what were you, a batsman, a bowler, all rounder?
Well,
What were you?
I was a bowler and a batsman. In my high school days, I was an avid cricket fan. Um, until a ball hit me on my head, and that brought you know my 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 sense of play or being actively engaged in cricket in a sense to an end. But obviously, I the interest was still there. And for us in the Caribbean, you know, um, given the geographical um, area we're in, obviously the West Indian team playing against others would be important. But generally speaking, Hindus and Indians would cheer on the Indian team whenever they're playing. And even whenever they're playing against the West Indian team, and again, I guess that shows the connection we share, with our brothers and sisters in ancestral India. So cricket was my thing, but I've kind of lost some interest over the years because you there's so many things that occupy your life. So my one more serious dedication right now is to try to do as much as I can to make sure our history in the Caribbean, primarily in Guyana, are being recorded, properly recorded. From our perspective, the late Brijlal from Fiji, made the point that we have to play a role in our history. In the old days, it was the Europeans, who have established that history for us, with all the stereotypes and everything else that they label us with. But we do have to play that role. It's important now that India is also going through a sort of a cleansing of the mind, a rejection of the old Machiavellian, syndrome that has been, dumped on us, as Indians. So that's a process, and I think we have to, as I said, we have to play that significant role in defining who we are, because after all, we are, um, you know, the people that people are writing about. So we need to have a say in how that history is shaped, right? And I think that's a crucial element in defining ourselves.
So maybe we can start from the beginning. So if you could, let's take this. Let us structure it in a way where we go to the first instances of Hindus reaching the Caribbean islands. How did they come? And maybe what was the early period of the Hindu journey in the Caribbean islands? Maybe we can start there. If you could tell us a little bit about that.
All right, so a little bit of history, and I don't want to, lose your audience with all the numbers, but in a nutshell, slavery was abolished, in 1834. So then there was a need, of course, by the Europeans to kind of create that, to fill that vacuum. So what we have is a situation where, um, the immigrants or the Girmitias from India were taken to all of these diasporic communities owned by the Europeans, right? The same process by which they went to in 1834 into Mauritius. That process was used as an example of a successful way of extracting Indians from India and taking them to work in a sugar plantation. So the plantation owners in the Caribbean um, replicated that same sort of experiment with Mauritius. So the first country where Girmitias were brought to in the Caribbean was Guyana. This is in 1838. Right? So in 1838, you've got the first two ships landed in May, the Hesperus and the Whitby. And then in Jamaica, 1845, you had the Fatel Rozak landed in that colony, British colony. And then there was a Dutch colony, Suriname, where the first ship came much later in 1873, right? The Lala Roque, which landed. Now, of course, there are sprinklings, of Indians in some of the other Caribbean countries, Guadeloupe, Martinique, and so on. So the process of them being brought was very similar to the way they were being brought in Mauritius and Fiji and Natal in South Africa, and so on. So over the course of the years, the actual number in Guyana, 238 plus thousand were bought. Trinidad, 143,000. Suriname, 34,000. Of course, Jamaica, 36,000 Indians were brought. So when you look at that number, when I say Indians, the majority of those who were brought, about 85% were Hindus, right? The rest were Muslims and a sprinkling of Christians. So that 85% represented the bulk of the population who were taken to these places. And pretty much overall, we can say that they work for a 5 year period. That's the term of their contract. They were given an opportunity to renew that for another 5 years, right? But historically, about 30 to 35% of the population whose contract were expired were now able to return to ancestral India, right? So you're looking at about 70-75% of them remaining. Interesting scenario, because obviously they were now becoming permanent fixtures of these Caribbean diasporic areas, right? And so they began to build their lives and so on. So for us, again, that period, as I said, goes back to 1838. So today, we see some processes that are taking place. We see more of what we call creolization where you've lost some of the the religious values that came with the original Indians. There are some things that are still connected. Like I can tell you, when we have Hindu weddings, like we can trace our ancestors back to Allahabad, where my family came from, in UP. When there is a Hindu wedding, there is something which we call a matikor. I don't know if that's still being done in certain parts of India, but this is where the bride um, is very decorated. They go off and they do something called digging dati. Right, this is on the Friday before the wedding, on the Sunday. So we do have those, pristine cultural elements that we came in. But to put all of this in a nutshell, today in the three countries that I mentioned, Trinidad, Guyana, Suriname, Hindus are about, I'd say, about between 18 to 25%, right, of the population. So we're looking at fifth and sixth, um, generation of Girmitias. And as I said, I am a third generation. So we do have some challenges, but I do want your audience to also know that um, part of our challenge today, well, it's multifaceted. But one of the challenges that people need to understand is that Hindus, um, and Christian Indians, and of course Muslims, they don't consider themselves connected to India, obviously, but they're seen as Indians, because in these societies that have now evolved as multicultural, multi-ethnic societies, the challenge also is being faced from the African population. So in Guyana, for instance, Africans have controlled Guyana for 28 years, from 1964 to 1992. And during that period, there was a total destruction of, Indian family culture and so on. And because of that, the Indian population, which was about 52%, let's say in 1980, has now been reduced to about 39%. So today we have a country, Guyana, where the majority of the population lives outside, um, of the country itself. Many of them in North America, parts of Queens, and so on. Um, and one of the other challenge which we can talk about is, especially for Hindus, is the onslaught of conversion, proselytization, which obviously goes back, to the Europeans who saw the Indians as the Koli, who ought to be saved and who ought to be civilized and being brought into the real world. So those challenges continue, but it is a serious problem for Hindus, because you're being faced with all kinds of symbols and messages from the Western, Christian establishment that are very prominent in the Caribbean. So that's in itself a very, very significant challenge, right, for us. And I would say, and we can talk more about this later. One of the other thing I just want to mention is the fact that um, we also have to be self-critical about who we are. So we don't have the leadership among us who understand that ideologically, to be a Hindu, right? If you're a Muslim, Mecca is important, right? And if you're a Christian, so is Jerusalem. But if you're a Hindu, and if you call yourself a Hindu, then obviously India has to figure prominently in how you define yourself. So we don't have that strong connection. And I think I would allocate the blame for that on our leadership on the ground. And also, as we were discussing earlier, it's the way India has historically looked at, the diaspora, something that's very, very different when you compare how the Chinese look at Chinese in Malaysia or Singapore or wherever, or how Israelis would look at Jewish people, who may live outside of Israel. So those would be some of the challenges, and that, hopefully your audience can understand that historical evolution of who we are, right?
Maybe we can start. I also had one question. when it comes to the migration of the Hindu population originally from India to the Caribbean islands, what parts of India was majorly this? Um, could it be only from UP and Bihar primarily?
Primarily in Northeast, we're looking at UP and Bihar. There were some people who came from Chennai, Madras, right, the state of Tamil Nadu, and if you were to go to the Caribbean, Guyana um, or Trinidad or Suriname, you would be able to recognize them. We can recognize them because the folks in Tamil Nadu would be um, engaged in something called Kali Mai Puja, right? So when you go to the ceremonies, that's what you will see. But one of the things you would also notice if you were to travel around, you could tell which home has a Hindu family living because they would have their flag, right, which we call the jandi. Red would be for Durga, for instance, and those flags would be prominently displayed in front of the homes. But so you're looking at Madras, you're looking at Bihar and UP. Primarily Bihar and UP were the two dominant states. The popular states. It's, I guess it was easy for the picking when the Europeans were trying to recruit. And of course, they would use those fancy words to try to make you feel comfortable to go to these places. Words like Chimitat, Damra, Tapu, or for Suriname, it was called Sri Ram. So it didn't sound like a threatening place for you to take that major step to cross the Kalapani, right, to get to that location. So these were the sort of mischievous and deceitfulness, elements of the recruiting process, that was involved in trying to recruit that population and take them to those distant communities.
Okay, that's very interesting because one of the reasons I find out about the Bihari and UP connection was when I started listening to the soca chutney music, and a lot of the soca chutney music has um, UP Bihari folk songs like वो मोर तोर lava milai sakhi lava milai, and I was looking at the lyrics of the singer. I forgot the name of the singer. I just love the song. My wife put me onto it because my wife was more exposed to the Caribbean Hindu culture than I was, as she was a North American Hindu, and because in North America the Caribbean Hindus and the Canadian and American Hindus meet more often. So when I got married, and she would tell me all these interesting bits. But now maybe we can talk about this first, because let's get the negativity out first. And I want to say you are spot on in saying that India has let the Caribbean Hindus down, and I say this as an Indian. In fact, to be very honest, India has let every single Hindu down outside India. I will not just say the Caribbean Hindus, and there is a reason for that. As we were discussing offline, sir, it's my request. Could you narrate that story of the Hindu Students Union in the 1980s when Indira Gandhi had visited North America for the viewers?
Yeah, well, I was sharing an example of how confusing India's foreign policy can be, especially when it comes to Girmitias or descendants of Girmitias living abroad, right? We were students. I was a student at City College, and we had a young student group very concerned about the plight of Indians in Guyana because at this time, there was a dictatorship and there was a sort of a Africanization, militarization of Guyana, which was obviously under control of a minority black government. So Hindus and Indians were, in a sense, forced to leave because they were, obviously they were threatened and they could not really survive under a dictatorship because they were opposing the system. Religious items were being banned because the government was trying to, control the economy, make sure, um, it has a good control over the people living in the country. So you have all of those, elements of what Guyana has become, a dictatorship, right, which ended in 1992. So we were students here, and we had an Indian group, and we figure, well, one of the things we ought to do is to reach out to India. The Indian consulate in New York reached out to us as an Indian organization and said, "Here's an opportunity to meet, with the Prime Minister Indira Gandhi, who I believe was assassinated in '84, if I'm not incorrect." But so our meeting
She
was at
was. She
okay.
was assassinated in 1980.
All right, so this was 1980 or 81 when we were invited to meet with her. So we drafted out an extensive letter listing all of the abuses that Indians faced in Guyana, and we, reached out to her. And as she was passing, I put it in her hand. We did the namaste, put it in her hand. She took that letter. It was a big packet, and she handed it over to her, I guess, her security guard. We heard nothing after that. So in our mind, this was an indication, and we have long suspected this, that India has a very convoluted policy when it comes to Indians abroad. And that has been the tradition, since the Nehru generation. Um, so what we're seeing now, there's some signs of hope. Recently, Narendra Modi has reached out, or at least congratulated the president of Suriname, Santoki. In fact, I believe Modi on his monthly show, I forget the name of his show, where he said, here's a person, who's
Man Ki Baat. His show is Man Ki
there you
Baat.
go, Man Ki Baat, and he congratulated the president of Suriname, saying, "Here's a person, whose family he swore on the Gita, when he took the oath, and here's a person who, has a long tradition of being connected to India." And so it was a sign that India was reaching out, right? So this was a whole different scenario that existed in the pre-Modi era. So we were very disappointed. And I'll share this with you, why India has to have a meaningful role. But first to begin, you expect the motherland, to be concerned about Indians abroad, right? And we're not seeing a lot of that. We had a whole month of or a few weeks of racial attacks against Indians in South Africa, even in an area that was named after Gandhi. There was a very tepid, a very lukewarm response from the Indian government, right? In Guyana, we've had a long tradition of events where Indians were being uprooted and so on. I can cite one example. Is a place called Wismar in 1964, where an entire village, of course, this was during the colonial time, so responsibility does lie with the governor and the British, but you can't ignore the fact that it was Africans who actually uprooted Indians. Every Indian in that area was uprooted. Indian women were raped, right? Their properties were being burned, um, and they were driven out from that area. Right, that's a place called Wisma. I'm sharing that as an example, but there are many others. Right, for instance, in 1980 there was a coup in Suriname where some of the labor unions were killed. Um, and so on. And we continue to have these abuses. And closer to home in Fiji, we have a series of coups where the population of Fiji which was about 50%, has now been reduced to uh, I guess 40%. So what my point is that we don't see that role that India should be playing, to reach out. And here's a good reason, an important reason why India should actually reach out to the Indian population outside of India, because it means that you're now, giving some kind of moral support to people outside of India, where they can be some, act as some form of lobbying, right, for whatever India wants to do, whether it's at the UN or so, or whatever. Guyana today is considered to be the future Dubai of the Caribbean. There have been tons of oil fields that were discovered in Guyana. India has technology, in terms of developing oil industries where they can really play a role. So that's an important trading link for India right there. And it's also another way, not just in Guyana, but for India to kind of rebuff, or at least, challenge the encroachment made by India's enemy, China. In the last decade or so, China has been playing a major role in many of these countries where Indians live, and especially those three that I mentioned. So we don't see that same response from India playing that role, right? Especially given the fact that you have a significant percentage of the Hindu population that reside in these places. So in a nutshell, I'm a little pleased that to see that the changes going on in India, where India is in a sense reviving, or having a renaissance, so to speak, of who they are. And hopefully, with that renaissance taking place in India, you will see a much more aggressive foreign policy where India can actually um, really believe that the diaspora community, not just in North America and so or Europe, but in these other smaller areas, right, can play a significant role. But that connection has to be much stronger, and unfortunately, I don't see that. See, one of the positive things I would say, Kushalji, about us when we came on the ships, right, the Jihaji Bahin, um, brothers and sisters, the shipmates as they call them, the whole division, that whole notion of the caste division ended. It ended not necessarily on the ship, but also on the plantations. Because remember, they were struggling, they were working together, they were dealing, with an oppressive society. So over the years, Indians kind of developed that brotherhood. I mean, when I meet Indians from India, I meet a Gujarati or I'm Bengali, and so we don't have that concept. And if you've met with Indians from the Caribbean, that kind of language is not part of our repertoire, right? So we're seen as a united group, except obviously that we're divided, by
On
Christian.
religion.
Right, exactly. So that's something we've kept together as a it's kept us together in terms of brotherhood and sisterhood, and that exists for us. Um, Obviously, Indians are seen as people who are primitive because they're always accused. And again, it goes back to the European tradition. They worship idols and so on. They're uncivilized. They're live in a rural community. So the entire whole notion of all the stereotypes that were developed about Indians continues today. So so the whole notion of having an ideological sense of who we are, which can connect the folks in Guyana, Hindus in Guyana with Hindus in Trinidad, Hindus in North America, Hindus in India. That link is not there, and I think that link has to be made. Um, and it has to come from both sides. We don't have, the leadership in the Caribbean that understands. And they're always being challenged when they refer to things Indian, or trying to make connection with India. We don't have political leaders, for instance, who understands that this is an important cultural link, right? So you can be a Guyanese, you can be a Trinidadian, you can be a Surinamese, but at the same time, that's a legal definition, but you can also be a Guyanese and a Hindu, right? That's a Hindu element is your cultural definition of who you are. So we don't even have leaders who are bold enough, right, to say, hey, I'm an Indian, I'm a Hindu, I love India, so I have a tradition that goes back to generations. We don't even have that because there's always that fear. So education, I would say, is an important element also in what we're doing. And that's a whole different area. We don't have anything in the curriculum that really defines who we are. We're simply mentioned as people who came, there's a very small history um, uh, of who we are, and it's always historical. It doesn't really deal with the current situation of who we are, right? I mean, when you look at the world today, ethnicity is a defining concept for everyone, right? People have to know who they are, right? So there was always this challenge that, okay, we're Trinidadians, we're Guyanese, right? So you don't need to be a Hindu, you don't need to be a person who gets emotional over things that connected to India. So those are the challenges we have. I also have to say that when you look at the curriculum in terms of education, that's a key element, right? Um, Most Indians do not go into, the social sciences. My father used to tell me, well, you got to be a doctor, you got to be a lawyer. So we don't have that core set of people who goes into, that field so they can understand themselves, their society, and so on. So that's the curriculum does not reflect. Um, the fact that we live in multicultural, multi-ethnic societies. One of the things, I'll give you an example, where our leaders also let us down. We normally celebrate something called Indian Arrival Day, right? For Indians in Trinidad, I believe it's in June. They've passed a law. It's called Indian Arrival Day. That's when the day they came, right? For us in Guyana, um, the government is afraid to use the word Indian, so they call it Arrival Day. So the word Indian is not included because in their minds it sends a wrong message to the African population. I know, I see the look on your face, and that is how convoluted this is. So there is that education element, right? And so we don't have that in the curriculum, right? From the get go. Even at the university level, we don't even have, a history course on Indian indenture. We don't have history courses that deal with the Indian experience. So that is the level of where we are. Now, there are courses at the University of the West Indies at that level, but in Guyana, for instance, we don't have anything that comes close to that. So education is a major issue. We're kind of lacking and failing this next generation of Indians. I mean, I can give you another example. One of the things we raise, another issue, is the government has created a series of books, right, to promote literacy, which is a noble cause, right? It's a goal that everybody should hold on to because it's important. But they've produced a series of books, depicting events, right? Um, but when you look at those series of books, it does not include or give equal representation to Hindus or Indians overall. There's also a small population in Guyana, the native Amerindians, I mean, not just Guyana, but in the Caribbean. So even their stories are not being told. So it's a sort of a creolization of the process. So I think for us, the challenge is a major one. We have to kind of go back and create that sort of a renaissance to be able to kind of, recoup so much that we have lost over the years. And I don't see the you know the leadership coming from the Hindu community. There are very few, who are doing that. So it's a challenge, it's a significant challenge. And then on the other hand, we have that sort of a lackadaisical effort by India, um, to kind of reach out to Indians in the diaspora. So the challenges are humongous. It's they're Himalayan, if I can use that term. So we're kind of left, like defenseless, with the sharks, and I think what you're going to see and what has been happening is you're seeing a continuous decline of the Hindu population. So that number that I give you, that ranges between, in the three major countries, from let's say 18 to 25, that number has declined, let's say 10 years ago, and we're seeing a continuous decline, of the Hindu population. Um, and that trend, by all indication, is going to continue. So again, that's another situation we have to deal with, right?
Yep. Yeah. So I guess the problem is, again, this stems from the larger debate, Dr. Baytoram, in India, where, as I was telling you offline, that what is the nature of India? What is, if I was to use the Sanskrit term chitti, what is India's chitti? I had Dr. Gautam Desiraju, and we had a discussion on his book Bharat India 2.0. And one of the things that India has always struggled, and it starts even if you look at the Constituent Assembly debates in India that we had in the first few years post the Britishers left India, was on one hand, there was this Nehruvian idea of India, where India is a British construct and the British really united India, and there was nothing, basically different jatis living different places, and they had nothing in common. There is no such thing. And then uh, the North American Indology departments coming up with Neo Hinduism, Neo Hindutva, Neo Hinduism through, they say it is Vivekananda, Arya Samaj, Swami Dayanand Saraswati. Later on, you have Sri Aurobindo. These three primarily they focus a lot on coming up with this entity called Hinduism. Then there is this absurd little corner that would also say that Hinduism starts with Advaita Vedanta and Shankaracharya doing something. I don't know. There are so many theories going around. I think sometimes there is a reason why Hindus don't go to social sciences because, to be very fair, they just don't make any sense beyond a point to the average person when they listen to so many theories out there. And then on the other hand, there is this classical idea that India is a civilizational state, and the nature of that civilizational state, whether it was Sri Aurobindo in his works till 1919, I mean, multiple works where he has mentioned them, or whether it's Swami Vivekananda, whether it's Sarvapalli Radhakrishnan, or even the ancient Indian gurus, and this is not to deny the problems inside the Indian society. Hindus are not unique, as if Hindus are the only ones who have problems and everybody else is just holding hands and singing Kumaya. Everybody has problems, and Hindus are not. I mean, at least I'm not one. Anybody who knows my podcast knows I go after Hindus a lot, for the record, for their problems. But the problem that what you're facing stems from the debate in India, where India refuses to acknowledge its civilizational identity, which is Sanatan Dharma, whether we like it or not, even if we don't want to use the term Hindu, because I think that's not the correct term itself. The civilizational identity of India is Sanatan Dharma. And depending on how far you want to take it back to, at least it is a 6,000 year continuing civilization. And that civilization has problems like any other civilization, but it is a civilization. And the negationism of that reality in India in the post Nehruvian state and the small efforts to correct it, and let me be very clear, while the Narendra Modi government is making some positive steps, they're just not enough. In my opinion, they're just not enough. And like you said, in the Caribbean diaspora or the African Hindu diaspora, they shy away from even using the word Indian, but that disease is there in India. They shy away from using the word Hindu. Like uh, the Nehru, and this is not secularism like the French practice it. The French are just concerned with the separation of church and state, and they are very vehement about it. But the French have a civilizational identity which is based on the French language, French culture, many things. The French don't shy away from their nature. The Indian and the Indian way of being secular was denying everything that the civilization had and actively enforcing it on everyone else while creating minority ghettos in India, where somebody is a Muslim, somebody is a Christian, somebody is this, but a Hindu is not a Hindu. And the Indian state actually actively works in denying the Indian identity, which is Sanatan Dharma. And so what you're facing, I'm just trying to present to you why what has gone down in the diaspora outside India. It trickles down from this mindset in India through its founding fathers, and that is the reason. Whatever problems they're facing now, maybe one more question, and then I want to talk about the good things also, because I don't want to leave people with a bad taste in the mouth. But if you could tell, you have written about, you wrote a book about, you know uh, the problems and the politics of Guyana and the problems Hindus have faced. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that, because you're a Guyanese. So if we could talk about it, what are the problems Hindus have faced, maybe, and then I'm going to ask you cultural questions because I already have many.
All right. So let me just say, when in terms of the Hindu population, we do have the Sanatanists who are the majority, right? And then there, in the early 1900s, we had, missionaries, Arya Samajas coming into the Caribbean, who were very much involved in trying to promote, you know, or build the Arya Samaj community. And generally, when they came, they would go to Guyana, Trinidad, Suriname, because that's where the majority of the Indian population would reside. But so you do have some kind of friction, but it's not an open friction as we've seen, let's say, between Indians and Africans. So within the Sanatanist community, since they're the majority, they have extended and they've built temples and so on. A lot of Hindus would pray in their home and something we call the matia, or something that they build next to their home. But you would see a lot of temples in the Caribbean, and but the people who have emerged as the leaders of these organizations, the Sanatanists, are themselves in a way not very progressive, in the sense that they understand the ideological framework of who we should be as Hindus, or who we are as Hindus. So they would be like the local person in the village who could speak a little bit of Sanskrit, a little bit of Hindi. So that power comes to them, and they use that power to elevate themselves in the community, but they're not generally concerned, right? They would not be the sort of a progressive Hindu who you would like to see as a person who would address things like, hey, there's suicide is a problem. There's people, who alcoholics, right? That's a major issue in the Indian community. Or let's build some, Hindu schools. Let's teach Sanskrit. Let's talk about Indian history. Um, Even if they do that, it's done at a in a limited way. So you don't have that mass outreach. The one time I would say, and I would argue that, when you had that sort of a limited renaissance about India within the Caribbean diaspora, and I think that would be extended to other diasporas also, goes back to the early 1900s. Obviously, this is a time, when you had concerns, or there were news about India. Gandhi was on the scene; he was fighting for independence. Rabindranath Tagore, was a symbolic person at the time. And India was going through that, sort of movement for Swaraj, right, fighting for independence. So the diasporic Indians, whether they were Christian or Hindus, they saw India as being a sort of a place which, in a sense, was the bastion of Indian culture, right? But maybe not necessarily for the Christians so much, because they have accepted Christianity, right? A lot of them being Presbyterians, or whatever, denominations of Christians they would have been. But still, even among the Christians, you still had that reverence, right? India was seen as a place of tremendous culture, awareness, and so on. So they were very much defensive of India. And I think that continued, right? We've seen in the 1930s, 19, early 1900s in Suriname, you had an Indian organization that was formed, right, to address Indian concerns. The same thing in Trinidad, the same thing in Guyana. And they were fighting for other things also, right? Things like the right to vote, expansion of the franchise. But they were always very conscious about what was happening in India. So when they have their meetings, for instance, in Guyana, they would sing the Indian national anthem. Pictures of Rabindranath Tagore would hung prominently in their homes. So an organization like their British Guyana Dramatic Society, for instance, in the 1930s up to World War II, would be very much prominent in is selecting plays, right, coming out of India, plays by Sudraka, Kalidasa, and especially Tagore, plays like Chitra, you know, um, you know, the king or queen, Malini, Gora. These were plays that they would translate into English, and they would perform them, right? They wanted to be authentically Indian, and they felt this was the way to go. But we've seen all of that reversal, right, come after independence, because the government was changed, right, and Indian culture, Indians themselves were being marginalized. So we've seen a reversal of that. So the 1930s were a little different. um, but the Sanatanists are still there. They're also very much aligned with the government of the day. But the unfortunate thing is you don't have that willingness, right, or that aggressive a move to kind of link the Hindus together in the sense of educating them, providing education. So we don't, and I spoke about the curriculum where Indian history is missing, and we don't have a lot of educated people who are leaders in these Indian communities who understood or understand the nature of the problems that they're dealing with. They deal with very parochial issues, right? One of the things that I think they should be calling for would be things like government sponsors of schools. That's crucial, right? The Christians have their money coming in, the Muslims have their money coming in from the Middle East, but Hindus don't have that, and we don't get the allocation from the government. In Trinidad, the Sanatan Dharma Mahasabha on their own raised their money to build their own schools, but we don't have a national attempt, right? We don't have subventions, we don't have money coming in, to promote or put Hinduism on a same equal footing as the other, religious entities. So all of those things, are in a sense challenges that we do face, right? So we've kind of drifted away from this whole notion of India being we've got people like myself and others, people like the former prime minister of Trinidad, Basdeo Pandey, and so on, who have gone to India. They've received the Pravasi Bharatiya Saman Award, right, which was implemented since, I believe, 2003. But that's as far as India will go in terms of recognizing, right? You give them an award and that's the end of it. You go home, right? Then we wait for the next one the following year. Where is that continuous connection? We don't see that, right? We don't have that. We've never had it during the Nehru, years, but we're seeing signs of it happening now, and I think that has to be continuous, right? That has to continue to kind of build that bridge, right? And even among the intellectuals among us, right? We don't see that. They don't see, when you look at the black population, for instance, right? They've tried to unite people in the diaspora by talking about things like, black pride, something called negritude, Pan-Africanism. We don't have attempts by even our own intellectuals. In fact, some of our intellectuals are bashing Hinduism. I'm sure you're aware of the anti-Hindutva, whatever they call it, big event last year, right? We have some of our own people who are part of that tradition. Someone, for instance, Gayatri Bahadur wrote a famous book called Koli Woman. She's part of that group that continues to bash Hinduism in India and wherever it exists. So challenges upon challenges, that's what we're dealing with, and we're fighting, to keep the culture going. But that's what we're dealing with.
So, okay, so let me ask you this now, because now let's get into the culture itself. So do Caribbean Hindus have a temple culture, and how much of a role has, let's say, the temple played in building the life of the community, and then how do the temples run? So what happens there?
Well, the temple is the one major structure that's there, right? And historically, that has evolved because the person who was recognized in the community who could, who may have some knowledge of the Vedas, or who could speak Sanskrit or Hindi. When the Hindus came, they came with their books, right? They came with the Bhagavad Gita, they came with the Vedas. Um, but the challenge would have been being able to understand, right? To be able to explain. Like if you're reading a shloka, for instance, are you able to translate that and make meaning of it when you're taking a phrase, from the holy text? Are you able to explain that? Not many people are capable of doing that. So the temple was really the basis. And this is, I think, an important role that they play. This was the basis for preserving Hinduism, because as if you travel throughout the Caribbean, you would see a lot of temples, and of course, you would recognize them by the shape, right? You would, maybe a swastika sign, or, one of the god or goddesses, maybe in front or inside. You would see definitely the jandi, the flags as we call them, right? So you would see that spread out throughout Indian villages, because that's where the activity of Hinduism was being practiced, right? So the local person who had some knowledge, who you could identify as the one, who has some level of education and respect, that person would kind of help, to raise funds to build that temple. But a lot of times these things are done as part of a family affair, right? So it's very parochial. You would go to the temples on Sundays, have a hawan. If there's a wedding, you would have the wedding in those premises. But that's a traditional way, and that still continues very much today in the Caribbean, because it is
Hmm.
the one place where Hindus can congregate, especially on a Sunday, right? Or there's a wedding, they get together, they sing, and then you would have the local, what they call a pandit. And again, these are not necessarily very educated people, well versed in the language or the tradition, but they know more than the ordinary person, so they could perform those functions, right? The rituals and so on. So people feel good, and then they go back home, and then they have to deal with all of the issues that society brings to them, right? So, and again, that's where the challenge is outside of the temple. But the temple, uh, you know uh, that's there. So that's the one institutional feature. Of course, as we get into the 50s and 60s, Bollywood has played a significant role. My idols were Shashi Kapoor, Amitabh Bachchan. So the entire village, 70s and 80s would come out, right? They would walk to the theater, right? And they would go to see these movies, and then they come back
Wow.
home, right? And then there was some schools in these temples where, you would have people would teach them Hindi, right? I mean, India has played a limited role over the years, over the decades, by giving scholarships, right, to Indians to go to India. So we do have a handful of scholars, who were trained in India, who studied in India. One of the most progressive, significant, who understand the society very, very well, who has built a Hindu school, and whose students do very well, Swami Aksharananda. His school, I would say, is one of the best there is. He has a PhD in Hinduism. He's well trained. He understands the issues. So we don't have many folks like him, right? Who can really understand everything that's going on, and he's also willing to take actions. He's a frequent writer in the letter columns addressing Hindu issues and so on. Like when you have an event and only the Christian prayer is being recited, where is the Hindu presence? So you have a few of those voices that are significant and very important. And his school, as I said, is very, very. If you do happen to get a chance to visit Guyana, that would be one of the place. Students are very disciplined, right? They're dressed in this saffron uniform, and it is a very, they've topped every exams every year. They come out a winner, right, from the time of their, from the time they have been. Established, and that continues. So we need more of that, and we also need to kind of include the temples into the more social work that needs to be done. The UN, a few years back, has noted that there is a specific location where most Hindus live, a place called Blackbush Pola, where you have the highest per capita rate of suicide in, um, in the country. So those are things that need to be addressed, right? So there's a real need for these religious organizations to be more socially oriented, to address, all of these, problems that you see within the Hindu community. And I don't want to sound very bleak, but I'm just trying to present a reality of the situation, in terms of what we're dealing with.
We'll get into what maybe. Okay, let me ask then how can we maybe help? Okay, so I am an Indian Hindu from India. I am now hosting this platform, and whatever I've made of it in the last 5 years, I've come to a certain spot as far as this platform is concerned, where it has a, I won't say a huge voice, but a significant voice inside the community in India and in the diaspora, whatever little voice I have. So, what can I do, or what can we as Indian Hindus do to help the Hindu community in the Caribbean islands then?
Well, in terms of things that can be done specifically, there are organizations, right? A lot of them are also based in the diaspora, that that make frequent donations and things like that. But I'm thinking more of a sort of a broad-based approach, and I think it goes back to this whole notion of understanding who we are. And when I say broad-based, I mean it has to be tackled at a level that really has a serious impact, right? A long-term impact. And I think education is really one place where we have to be able to look at what kids are learning in school and maybe lobby the government, right? Lobby governments to make sure we have an inclusive voice. So that would be one area, right? Certainly, there are needs of people, immediate needs that needs to be addressed because you can't, administer, let's say, therapy to a person um, who who's having other issues to deal with, like bread and butter issues. So those things have to be addressed, and I think organizations have to play a role in mobilizing support for those groups. Now, social media obviously is, something that we're all in, is a major development um, around the world, and I think if we can connect with other organizations and maybe continue to expand, right, to widen the scope, to get more people to listen. Um, I think part of it has to be an education process, right? So we can link up with organizations that may have information about resources, right, where you can access resource. And I think again, social media can play an important role in terms of providing information, educating people about who they are. And I think that discussion has to continue. I don't think we can really do much as individuals, but I do believe that um, the discussion about issues facing, Hindus has to continue, and those outreach has to be made with groups that are on the ground, right? That are doing something already, that are already established, and trying to work with those groups to try to promote that level of education, and also sharing information about resources that may be available and where to access those resources, because one of the things we know is that if people don't know that there are certain kinds of resources that exist, then it would be difficult for them to tap into those kinds of resources. So information is very crucial, getting information to people, and I think that's where, to answer your question, where we can help, right? um, Aside from that, I think if we are concerned about, if the question is about being concerned about Hindus and maybe other groups of people who are facing similar challenges, I think lobbying government, right, bringing this information to government, and focusing attention on these issues are very, very, very crucial also, so that policies can be developed, funding can be allocated, and outreach systems can be set up to address issues that these communities may face. And it's not just necessarily the Hindu community, but there's a most Indians in the Caribbean tend to live in a rural, right, area, because they develop the agriculture base, and they kind of they're kind of connected to the land. So that, especially that community, needs to have access to resources and information. So those would be some ways I would say that we can address some of the problems that we're dealing with.
So, is proselytization a problem for Hindus in the Caribbean?
It has historically been a major problem. It continues to be a major issue that Hindus have to deal with. And as I said, one of the, when you look at the trend of the Hindu population, um, the percentage of Hindus, the number of Hindus have been declining, and there are some projections that if the trend continues, that population is probably going to be wiped out at some point, or be very minuscule. Um, and
Can I just come in and ask you a specific question?
yeah,
When it comes to reducing population, how much of it is due to proselytization, and maybe a significant chunk of it would be maybe they're just educated, and with education, your reproduction rates naturally tend to fall down?
I think with both, I mean, the issue has to do with education, and it has to do with the forces that you're up against, right? Um, Indians traditionally, we know the history of proselytization when it comes to that, right? That's no secret. when the Europeans came, for you to get a job, you have to be able to convert to Christianity. Hindu marriages were not recognized because they were considered heathens, and your kids were considered, if I can use the word bastards, or illegitimate. That's, so those were challenges that they were faced with, right? Even if a Hindu priest would consummate or help consummate the marriage between two people, it was still not considered legal. So traditionally, Hindus would have to convert to get a position in the government. That's how they get things like scholarship and so on. So Christian Hindus have always played a major role, right, in speaking out on behalf of Indians in general. Obviously, they have been, if they have accepted, Christianity, it's not something that they would defend, right, when it comes to Hindu. So they would, in other words, they would not defend the fact that Hindus should remain Hindus, right? They've converted, so they would like to see other people, follow the same path. So many of the leadership, many of the organizations in the 1930s that I mentioned, were led by, but not necessarily all of them Christian Indians, but there was a significant percentage of Christians who were engaged in leadership of those organizations. So that's part of it, right? It's the education. To come back to the whole notion of proselytization, um, you have organizations that are being funded from the West, very, very aggressive, right? They have television program. What they do is they come and they set up a tent, right? And they would approach and they do this in Hindu communities, right? And they would say, look, we have a crusade. Can you join us? And what they would do, offer some maybe monetary, offer something in terms of money or promises, right? Your life is going to be saved. You're engaged in a religion, you know, um, that's not going to get you anywhere. So Christianity will save you, will help you save your soul. You'll go to heaven. Life will be better if you become a Christian. So you would see a lot of these tents, crusade tents, being set up. So the level of bombardment is very, very, um, it's massive, I would say. So you have that proselytization that continues, right? And of course, there's that whole notion that the Hindu, being a Hindu, is sort of you're not really civilized, in the sense that you're practicing a religion, that is ancient, that you're idol worshiping and things like that. So therefore, you need to be converted to save. So that is a tremendous issue that Hindus are dealing with. Of course, the Muslims have, as I said, they have their own funding, they have their own schools, they're very organized. You would see Muslims, women wearing hijab. This is something that has really changed over the last few decades. Christians have their own temples, they have a lot of money coming in. So we don't see that among Hindus. So that is a major challenge. So it's a level of education where a person who generally converts to Christianity does not share any allegiance, um, or very weak allegiance to Hindus or to India. So that's a break that comes with conversion, um, and that does exist throughout. Not just the Caribbean; it's there. Um, so in a nutshell, proselytization is a major concern for Hindus, and if you look at some of the responses and the letter columns and so on from religious leaders, this is an argument and a point that they generally make in the community, because it is often taken for granted that the Hindus are there. So, why have a Hindu priest? In a sense, you have to ask to make that request, right? To ensure that a Hindu element is there when you have public functions, especially in a society that claims that they're not promoting a specific religion. So Christianity has the dominant say in these cultures. And of course, the Muslim community are very organized, right? They do what they have to do. But the weaker ones, obviously, would be the Hindu community, where we don't have national support. We don't have, support from outside of India, or funds where we can tap into to help build Hindu schools and so on. So we don't have all of those things that the other communities have.
That's very interesting. And you know what I find fascinating in this entire process is that even within the African community of the Caribbean islands, I mean, Christianity obviously might be the major religion there, but like I've tried to ask this question to my whatever little Caribbean connections I have in the African descent. And I'm like, what happened to your ancestral faith? Do you guys try to explore it? And is there any interest? And, you know, like they don't even know much about it, which is the fascinating aspect. So I guess Christianity really did a number on them primarily first, till the extent that they have completely lost their connections to their ancestral faiths. Or I mean, but in our case, I guess we're the only living breathing people who actually fought back intellectually in the real sense, and we said, nah, we're not going anywhere. This is our idea, this is our faith, we're sticking to it no matter what you do. And I have to say credit to the Caribbean Hindus that there's still a major community in the Caribbean islands. They don't go away. They celebrate their festivals. You know, in that sense, I think the colonizer, I'm not saying they lost, but they never really won either with us.
Yeah. Well, you're absolutely correct about Africans being more creolized. They've lost their language, their religion, and so on. But there's one thing we can say about the African community is that they are united in the sense of knowing who they are. Now, they may not have the traditional language, or have the African name, or so on, but they are united, and they understand that movements like the Black Lives Matters, negritude or Pan Africanism, and so on. Those are issues and ideological elements that keep them united as a group. So yes, they have been creolized, and when they look at Indians, sometimes there is that sort of a contentious belief that, okay, we have lost our culture over the years, but you do maintain yours. In fact, sometimes that can be a source of tension, because there are some people who would argue, well, uh, you know obviously it's an incorrect argument to make, because it doesn't make any sense. They would say that, well, Hindus are the ones who are racist towards us, because they have this caste notion of people who are dark skinned, or should be on the bottom of the social scale, whatever. So they attribute that whole notion, and there's a couple of books that have been written about this by people who claim to be professors, about the caste system, connecting that to racism against black folks in the Caribbean. It's a fallacious, very, very fallacious argument, obviously. But yes, and you're also correct in the fact that Hindus have survived, and as I said before, there are some pristine elements of Hinduism that they have survived with. I can tell you, I don't know if this is still a tradition. I mentioned the Matikor celebration, where the woman, in a sense, become liberated. They do the henna, and it's a woman thing. And on Friday, they go out and what they call digging dati. There's a ceremony, right? That's involved. I used to be something what is called a saibala. When the brother was getting married, the boy can be a chaperone in the Hindu wedding. Um, so the saibala was an element of that. We get married
In
on
Punjab, we call it Sarbala, the
sarbala. There
small
you go.
boy that sits in front with the guy, the groom.
There you go. And we have something important when you get married in the old way, in the old days, and this is still done. It's the tent, right, that's being built. So we see you get married under a bamboo ceremony or a maro, right? So, and we do the traditional eating, with the leaf which we cut from the pond nearby, and we serve the food, on the leaf, right, the lily leaf. So that's something you would see. If you go to certain functions, there's a hawan, or even wedding, right? We do the seven curry. When we serve the food, there's seven. different curries that you can have, right? So that's a common thing that's there that all Hindus are aware of, and very much aware of, and so there are some of those traditional elements of what they brought with them, when they came in the 1800s, that still remains with them. And my guess is some of those traditions have undergone changes in Bihar and UP, right? So that could be a sort of a difference between, our Hindu community, where we are in the Caribbean, compared to where we were. I should say that one of the things that is becoming more common today is this sort of immigration root search, where people, are tracing their roots, right? We have the immigration pass. Basdeo Pandey, the Prime Minister of Trinidad, has done that. Kamala Bisesar, in Trinidad, who was also a prime minister, went back. She traced her roots. The entire village came out, to greet her. So that's a common thing, But one of the challenges that we are faced with is that some of those immigration records are not being protected, because you can take those records, the immigration pass, for instance, and trace your family back. I am currently doing that with from my mother's side, but it's becoming a sort of a common trend. And places like Fiji, Mauritius, Suriname have been successful in digitizing, right? Those records, so it becomes easy. So you could sit in a room in Bombay, and try to get a record of your ancestors who went to Fiji, right? Now, that's not done in all of the diasporic communities. I can tell you in Guyana, it's in terrible shape. Even with the so-called Indian government in place today, somehow dealing with anything that's connected to India or Indians, which would include documenting or digitizing our record for posterity, that's something that's not being done. So that's a sort of a trend that's developing. So I would argue that there's a sort of uh, a revival, but a small revival among a small group of people who understand that India plays a role for us as Hindus. So I'm seeing people trying to make that connection. Obviously, India is going to have a population, far greater than China in a couple of years. India is a major player, at the international level. So all of those things kind of serve to put India, in our view, right? So we can kind of make that connection, or at least revive the connection that we have kind of lost over the generation. So that's a positive sign that I think, that's developing. And I don't think people are ashamed of saying that, I'm a Hindu. I mean, there's still elements of those, but I think, as we kind of continue to make those connections, we're seeing that India can play a much greater role in our lives as Hindus, and it ought to, right? Because, as I said, you can't be a Hindu and not consider what's happening in India, right? That connection has to be there. So that would be a positive thing that I think that's developing. Um, you know,
That's that's good to hear. That's good to hear. So now I'm going to take a few questions before we wrap it up because we have to wrap it up soon. So let's take the first one, the most uncomfortable question, which is always stuck at Hindus. So do Hindus in Guyana practice casteism or any kind of purity and pollution?
Well, in terms of when we talk about caste, the first thing that comes to mind is, okay. There's one group of people who are superior, and everybody else, are inferior, right? We do have some of that exists in the temples, right, among the priests who, traditionally, I mean, priests will always claim that they are Brahmin. That gives them the power to say, okay, I can be a priest, right? But priests who can, being a Brahmin can also be something that's very corrupted, right, over the years. So that division has changed over the years. So it's not as very strict as it is maybe as you would see in India. So we don't have that, but definitely we do have the usual, things like dietary requirements where we don't eat beef or pork, things like that. So all of those elements stay within the Hindu tradition, but certainly, elements of the caste system as it exists in India, especially in the rural areas. We don't have that in the Hindu community, but people would like to say that they are a Brahmin, especially if they have some level of power or believe that they have that power over Hindus, and so therefore they can be a priest in the temple, right? So you would see those things rearing their heads, right, from time to time.
But what if, let's say, if I'm a trained pandit, I might be from any particular jati, it does not matter, right? By the so-called jati by birth system, which is practiced in different forms and different levels. But like in India, I'll give you an example now. The RSS, the Vishwa Hindu Parishad, and many other organizations are actively training people as pandits who are erstwhile called the scheduled castes and scheduled tribes or the Dalits in India, and they are making them pandits, and they are being absorbed in major temples in India as pandits. They go in as a pandit, so technically they are a Brahmin in that sense, and they do the puja, they do everything in those temples in India. So would that be possible in a Caribbean Hindu system?
Well, we have the Hindu, the Sanatanist organization that's connected, with the government, right? The People's Progressive Party, for instance, and this is another way they try to control the population because it's an important, voting block when you do that. But we do have some level of training. People are sent to India. They may go there for a couple of months or years or whatever, and then they come back with the knowledge, right? They can speak the language, so those people are automatically given. You've been to India, okay, then you're seen as an important person in the community, and if they want to become a local pandit, that's what happens. But very often also you have, the children of those people who were once considered pandit in the local village, but also develop, that tradition, and they now, so it becomes a generational thing where they can now become, a pandit who can administer services to the community. So in terms of training, we don't have a lot of that training taking place in the Caribbean, but it takes place outside of the Caribbean, which entails going to India, right, to receive that training. And it is seen once you've done that part of it, you can now make the claim that, okay, I've been trained, right? I can speak the language, and therefore the community will allocate that kind of accolade to that kind of person who makes those claims, because going to India is an important element to that training.
I'll tell you why, because I clearly remember in the year 2018, in the Times of Bangalore Mirror, if I remember, not the Times of India, it was the Bangalore Mirror. Uh, op ed was written by someone who's not very fond of Hindutva, by the way. His name is Devdutt Patnaik. And Devdutt Patnaik had written this opinion piece on a Sunday. I clearly remember this. It was called Hinduism in the Caribbean. And I'm going to read a quote from it. A unique feature of Caribbean Hinduism is that it doesn't have the caste system. People in this community came from mostly Bihar, the United Provinces, and the Madras province, belonging to different castes. As they traveled in ships together and lived side by side, they could not follow the rules of the traditional social hierarchy based on purity. There were very few women among the migrants, so it was not possible to marry only within a particular caste. Irrespective of their social status in India, they all did the same kind of work here. So the caste barrier eventually collapsed and they became a single homogeneous community. However, there is a small section of people who call themselves Pandits and function as Brahmins. They see themselves as the elite, directing people in spiritual and ritualistic way. So even a guy like Devdutt Patnaik, who's not very fond of Hindutva, is actually pretty much saying what you have experienced and said over here, that the caste system, basically, when Hindus leave India and they basically go on a plane or a boat or a ship or whatever, and they go outside India, the Jati Varna system pretty much collapses. And this is why I always say this, and I stand up for the diaspora. When caste is used as a shtick to beat the diaspora Hindu, that's unfair.
Mhm.
You want to talk about caste issues? You come to me. I live in India. You talk to us. Why are you going after those poor souls who have no consciousness? To be very honest, they have zero consciousness. And secondly, in the case of the Caribbean Hindus, another important aspect why the caste system cannot survive as they claim it to be is the Arya Samaj. Because the Arya Samaj, honestly, is one of the most reformist anti caste movements that India had by Swami Dayanand Saraswati. So if it has made so many inroads over there, it has to be a very diluted form. So, I just wanted to ask this question is A, because a viewer had asked this, and B, I had my answer ready because I remember I instantly got reminded of Devdutt's piece in 2018. And Devdutt is no fan of Hindutva. Devdutt hates Hindutva with a passion. So I thought I will use a critic of Hindutva to use and
Mm.
make the point over here. And now all the people, I have a lot of progressive left wingers also who listen to the podcast who think I am some, I don't know what they think about me. Now, please direct your hatred to Shri Devdutt Patnaik. So now I'm going to go on to the next question. Um, so do you think being in a way, so I think somebody has made a comment and a question together. Hindus in the Caribbean are the most resilient than the rest of the world. What helps them shape the strong Hindu identity in the Caribbean?
Well, there are a couple of factors here, right? And I just want to add before I get into that. So it's not just the caste system that has been eliminated, and most scholars tend to argue that this process started on the ship. Yeah, that's true, right? But I think it became much more non-existent on the plantations, because remember, these people were, the Grimitis were forced to work together. They were united when they had to fight, or when they were striking against the Europeans. So that sort of a jihadi experience on the ship was transferred to the plantation, whether it was a sugar or a coffee plantation. Um, and the other element of this, aside from the caste system, is we don't have this parochial, sense that we see in India. Like, my wife actually was born in New Delhi. She's from India. So people would say, well, I'm Gujarati, I'm Tamil. We don't say that in the Caribbean, right? We say we are Indians. Now, the academic would like to say, well, you're South Asians, you're Indo-Caribbean. But all of those terms can be used in context. But I would prefer the word Indian, because it implies that we're not hyphenated. We're here, as citizens, right, in this region. But I think the Hindu phenomenon, those two elements, right? Well, the plantation experience, the ship experience, um, you know, uh, living in these communities, cemented the whole concept of being a Hindu. I think the other thing we need to understand also is the fact that you have a society that is multi-ethnic. When these Hindus were brought, and Indians into these regions, remember, they were segregated, right? Because the Europeans wanted to keep you divided. If there was a strike, you shouldn't work with the Africans, the freed Africans, and so on. So you remained divided. So whatever cultural elements you had with you, that you came with, was preserved. It wasn't, in a sense, if I can use the word, contaminated, right? Obviously, as the years go by, you have the creolization, that Indians had they were faced with, but they were still resilient, right? So you had that threat coming from the other side, right? We're different from those Amerindians or the African communities. So Hinduism, in a sense, was also strengthened by the fact that Indians were isolated in communities, so they maintained that pristine level of the notion or the imagination of what India was, right? Over the years, and because they were also faced by threats from other communities, who saw them or labeled them as Indians or Hindus. So therefore, you were now forced, in a sense, to defend yourself, right? So you differentiate yourself from from the events and development on the ground, because you now see yourself as being different from the other communities. So therefore, they were, in a sense, forced to preserve who they are. So if they were not calling themselves necessarily Hindus, they would say we are Indians, because the other side would say, well, this is a Indian community, right? So that element of Hinduism was also preserved through those internal dynamics. And as I said, over the years, you had the missionaries coming from India, especially in the early 1900s. You know, the folks who were concerned about promoting Arya Samaj, Swami Dayanand. And then you have the whole notion of what was happening in India. So the focus was on India as a place where there was so much cultural, political changes taking place. So the idea of India and being Indian in the diaspora was still in the minds of those people. which continued. And obviously, as we said, as the country became independent in the night after World War II, you had more of a sort of a creolization process, but that ironically also helped to cement, right, and keep Indians and Hindus together. But as I said, the forces are tremendous, and we're losing members in the ranks as the days go by.
All right. So I guess before we wrap up today's podcast, any last words, Dr. Baitaram, that you want to give to the diaspora Hindus and the Hindus in India, both, or Indians in general, before we wrap it up?
Well, I think we need to recognize first and foremost, that as Hindus, we have an obligation, to pay attention to what's happening in India, right? That's the motherland, that's the ancestral land from which we came. But Hindus have a common problem, and this is another one I think I should mention. It doesn't matter which area in the diaspora we're living, we're also seen as soft targets. So anytime there's a conflict, the people who you pick on would be the Hindus. So it makes sense, and I'm saying that because if you look at what happened in South Africa, Fiji, Guyana, and all the Uganda, and all of those places where Indians went, we see there's a common trend to attack people for who they are, right? So it makes sense for us to kind of unite and keep the focus on who we are. But I think we also need to take our blinders off and in a sense not see each other as divided elements of the diaspora, because we do share some common experiences. Um, and I think once we can eliminate those bridges, if we can see all of us as being a part of the same Hindu family, it means that we can try to address some of the problems that we all face in our respective communities. I also believe that there has to be some kind of ideological orientation that unites us. I mean, Hindus in India are also divided, right? You talk about some of the concerns, right? We know India is going through a process where they're cleansing their education system, their minds, going back to tradition and looking at all of the elements that cause these divisions in India. I think we also need to kind of go through similar process, but I think the process, hopefully in India, um, which is going on there in terms of Hindus understanding who they are and understanding their history, is something that maybe we can learn from in the diaspora, so that we can try to kind of develop a sort of a Hinduism that keeps us more united, right? And keeps us more focused on understanding who we are historically, and as a people, who have a role to play in the different diasporic communities in which we live. So that's, I think that would be my message out there. And hopefully the folks in India don't consider us outcasts as they traditionally do, right? So we are Hindus, and I think we need to extend that broad social tent to include everybody into this Hindu family.
Absolutely, Dr. Baitaram. I can only say this, and again, these are my words. These are not Dr. Baitaram's words. So do not attribute what comes out of my mouth to his mouth. First of all, I've been a long proponent of political Hinduism, not from today, from a while. Um, what ails the Hindu society primarily is, and I say this again, these are my words, not Baitaram Saab's words, is the Jati Varna system, which I have always said that it should be completely annihilated right here, sitting in front of you, for the annihilation of Jati Varna. And because of that, we have created certain problems. And the solution to that was not proselytizing out of Hinduism, because it's not like the other side is giving you flowers. They got their own issues. All right. Stay Hindu. Don't fall for the Jati Varna system. Secondly, become a political Hindu. Political Hinduism is the solution for this. When you become a political Hindu, initially political Hinduism took its root in India. Political Hinduism has given you certain answers in India. India will always be the motherland of Hindus because 95% of global Hindus live in India. The reason I am going out of my way to do these chats with Hindus from the Caribbean islands, Hindus from North America, Hindus from the United Kingdom, I'm going to try and get Hindus from Africa, different parts of Africa. I'm going to try and get Hindus from every single part of the world to share their uniqueness, share their experience. Secondly, it is for our responsibility as Hindus from India to make sure that we do not subsume the Caribbean Hindu identity, the American Hindu identity, the Canadian Hindu identity, and make them like us. We should learn to accept them the way they are. So, so if you are a very conservative kind of a Hindu in India who does not do certain things, but you might see the Caribbean Hindus doing their dances, which is very much Caribbean in nature, that's yours now. Celebrate it, appreciate it. You may not find it to your taste. You might even find it shocking at times. But you know what? That's Hinduism. And you better learn to accept it. And once we have this political Hindu identity, that Hindus are a group at a global level, and India is the mothership, and everybody is an equal stakeholder. Even if there are two Hindus in some remote island in some part of the world, they are equal stakeholders in the political Hindu identity. They will disagree, they will argue, but they are one. And that is the political Hindu project. So I'll end today's podcast on that. And Dr. Baytoram, thanks a lot for coming on and
Thank
speaking
you,
with us.
Namaskar.
All right, guys. So if you want to follow Dr. Baytaram, I've left his Twitter handle. You can go and follow him on Twitter. Also, I would highly recommend go and read his books. I've left the Amazon link for his books in the description of the podcast. Doesn't matter if you're listening to the audio only version on iTunes or Spotify. Go and buy his books. You will get an interesting perspective on the Hindus in the Caribbean, primarily Guyana, obviously, because he's a Guyanese Hindu. But maybe in the future, I'll try to get a Hindu from Trinidad and Tobago. It's in the process. I'm going to get someone from Trinidad and Tobago too, and I want to do this, and this will be my life's mission. I have built this podcast to make sure that different voices come and speak over here. My viewers and my listeners have blessed me with the strength to keep on going because they keep coming back to me. I'm going to use that strength to give a platform to every single Hindu community wherever they are in the world, and I'm going to try and talk about them and try to reach them. So please keep supporting the Cārvāka podcast. Like this video, leave your comments over there, subscribe to the channel, try to become a member on Patreon or YouTube, or buy the Cārvāka podcast merch, or send your donations to UPI. I'll see you guys next time. Until then, namaste. Take care. Bye bye.